So glad you're back. You're going to love today's story.
Beatrice Vance laughed as she poured the vintage Bordeaux over Elena Vance's dress in front of the entire board. The deep red liquid bloomed across the cream silk like a fresh wound, cold and heavy. Elena didn't flinch. She stood perfectly still as the wine seeped through the fabric, clinging to her skin, while the hum of the anniversary gala died into a vacuum of stunned silence. The scent of fermented grapes and expensive perfume filled the narrow space between them, a suffocating mix of elegance and malice. "Oh, Elena," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with a mock sweetness that never reached her predatory eyes. She tilted the crystal glass further, ensuring the final, dreg-filled drops landed squarely on Elena's shoes. "I suppose I've done you a favor. That dress was a budget bin tragedy, and quite frankly, an insult to this ballroom. Now you have an excuse to disappear before the real guests arrive." Julian Vance stepped forward from the inner circle of directors, adjusting the gold links at his cuffs. He didn't offer a napkin or a hand to steady her. Instead, he let out a sharp, jagged laugh that seemed to signal the rest of the room to join in. "Mother's right. You've always had a knack for looking out of place, Elena. Why don't you head to the back? I'm sure the catering staff has an apron that would suit your station better." Elena looked around the room. Uncle Arthur was watching from near the mahogany bar, his face a mask of practiced indifference, while Sarah Vance whispered behind a manicured hand to a group of socialites. The board members, men and women who had smiled at Elena only an hour ago, now looked away, their eyes fixed on the bubbles in their champagne flutes. The power dynamic was as clear as the crystal chandeliers overhead. Beatrice was the queen of this domain, and Elena was merely a charity case they had grown tired of tolerating. Elena felt the rhythmic buzz of her phone inside her clutch. It was a specific vibration, 3 short pulses. It was the signal she had been waiting for from Marcus Thorne. After months of forensic digging, the sleeping lion had finally found the jugular. The Vance family's financial empire was a house of cards, and Elena was currently holding the only fan. "You're very quiet tonight," Beatrice sneered, stepping closer until the sharp toe of her designer heel pressed against Elena's damp hem. "Usually, this is where you start stuttering about how hard you try to fit in. Don't tell me you've finally realized that no amount of marriage certificates can turn a stray into a purebred." Beatrice reached out, her fingers trailing mockingly over the ruined silk of Elena's shoulder. The contact was cold, as calculated as the public humiliation. "You don't belong in this house, Elena. You never did. Julian was always meant for someone with a legacy, not a girl whose only inheritance was a pile of her father's debts." Elena finally looked up, meeting the older woman's gaze. For the first time in 5 years, the fear that usually clouded her eyes was gone, replaced by a terrifying, glassy calm. She didn't wipe the wine from her chest. She didn't pull away. She simply let the silence stretch until Beatrice's smirk began to falter, just a fraction. "Is that what you think this is about?" Elena asked, her voice low and steady. It was a tone she had never used in this house, a voice of authority that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards Beatrice thought she owned. "I think you're a mess," Julian interjected, his voice rising with a hint of unearned bravado. "And I think you're making the guests uncomfortable. Go home, Elena. We'll discuss your future, or lack thereof, in the morning." Elena glanced at her husband, seeing him clearly for the first time. He was a man built on the labor of others, a favored son who had never faced a consequence in his life. He looked exactly like his mother, arrogant, entitled, and completely oblivious to the cliff they were both standing on. "The morning," Elena repeated softly. She touched the small, silver locket at her neck, a gift from the only Vance who had ever truly cared for her. "Yes, the morning will be very interesting for all of us." She turned her gaze back to Beatrice, who was already signaling the orchestra to resume playing. The socialite dismissed her with a flick of her wrist, turning her back to rejoin the board members. Beatrice began to recount a witty anecdote about a trip to Milan, her laughter ringing out over the first notes of a violin concerto. She was so certain of her victory, so convinced of Elena's insignificance, that she didn't notice Elena wasn't leaving through the service exit. Elena walked toward the grand staircase, her wet heels clicking rhythmically on the marble. Each step felt like a drumbeat, a countdown to a reckoning they couldn't possibly imagine. Near the shadows of the heavy velvet curtains, Uncle Arthur caught her eye. He didn't speak, but his brow furrowed as he noted the way she carried herself, not like a shamed wife, but like a woman who had just signed a death warrant. She reached the top of the stairs and paused, looking down at the sea of silk and diamonds. Beatrice was at the center of it all, holding court, unaware that Marcus Thorne had just sent the final encryption key to Elena's private server. The documents were all there. The fraud, the embezzlement, and the legal loophole in the Vance trust that Julian had been too lazy to read. Elena pulled her phone from her bag. The screen glowed in the dim light of the landing. She didn't call a cab. She didn't call a friend. She dialed a number that had been saved in her contacts for 6 months under a pseudonym. "It's time," Elena said when the line picked up. "Start the liquidation. And Marcus, make sure the press gets the files on the anniversary foundations first. I want Beatrice to see the headlines before the sun comes up." She ended the call and looked down at the wine stain on her dress. It wasn't a mark of shame anymore. It was a war paint. Below her, the gala continued, a celebration of a legacy that was currently being erased in digital ink. Elena turned away from the light of the ballroom and walked into the darkness of the upper hallway, her heart beating with the cold, rhythmic precision of a ticking clock. The game hadn't just changed. It was over. They just didn't know it yet. The next morning, the sun bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Vance breakfast room, illuminating the dust motes dancing over a spread of untouched smoked salmon and artisanal cheeses. The air carried the cloying, heavy scent of white lilies and the sharp, acidic tang of Beatrice's double-shot espresso. Elena sat in the small breakfast nook, her fingers tracing a hairline fracture in the rim of her porcelain teacup. The only piece of the old set that the staff hadn't replaced with the gold-rimmed service Beatrice had ordered to celebrate the new era of the family legacy. Beatrice Vance didn't look up as she entered. The sharp, rhythmic click of her designer heels on the marble floor sounded like a countdown. She was already dressed for the day in a cream power suit that cost more than Elena's entire college tuition, her hair pulled back into a bun so tight it seemed to pull the very skin from her cheekbones. "You're late," Beatrice said, the words cutting through the quiet like a serrated blade. "And you still look like a tragedy. I hope you realize that your little performance at the gala last night cost Julian a potential lead for his Macau venture. People don't like investing in families that can't even keep their daughters from looking like common drunks." Elena took a slow, measured sip of her tea. It was lukewarm and bitter. "The wine was spilled on me, Beatrice. You were holding the glass." Beatrice finally looked up, her eyes cold and devoid of anything resembling a mother's warmth. She let out a short, mocking laugh that made the silver spoon in her hand clink sharply against the side of her cup. "A clumsy girl makes for a clumsy witness, Elena. No one cares who held the glass. They only remember who was covered in the mess. In this world, the stain is the only truth that matters." The door swung open, and Julian Vance stumbled in, his silk shirt wrinkled and his eyes bloodshot. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply reached over Elena to grab a piece of toast, his hand trembling slightly. "Mom, I need another 50,000, Julian muttered, his voice thick with the remnants of a long night. "The margin call on the tech stocks hit this morning. If I don't cover it by noon, they'll liquidate the position." Beatrice's expression softened instantly, a terrifying transformation from ice to doting indulgence. She reached out, patting his hand. "Don't worry, Julian. I've already spoken to the executors. Since Elena's father left the estate in such a disorganized state, I've authorized the sale of the lakeside cottage. Uncle Arthur handled the deed transfers years ago, so it's a simple matter of a private auction." Elena felt a cold spike of adrenaline hit her chest. The lakeside cottage was the only place where she had memories of her father that weren't tainted by the Vance name. It was a modest wooden house, filled with books and the smell of pine needles, a world away from the sterile marble of this mansion. "You can't sell that," Elena said, her voice steady despite the roar in her ears. "That was Dad's private sanctuary. It wasn't part of the anniversary foundations." "Everything is part of the foundation now, dear," Beatrice sneered, turning her gaze back to her tablet. "Or did you think your father's sentimentality would pay for Julian's future? You've lived off this family's name long enough without contributing. Consider the cottage your first real payment toward the debt of your existence." Julian smirked, his mouth full of toast. "Relax, Elle. It's just a shack. Once the Macau deal goes through, I'll buy you a condo in the city, somewhere with better plumbing." Elena felt the weight of the phone in her pocket. It vibrated, a single, sharp pulse. She didn't need to look at it to know it was Marcus Thorne. The liquidation she had ordered the night before was already beginning to chew through the digital layers of the Vance empire. She stood up, the chair legs scraping harshly against the marble. The sound made Beatrice flinch, a small, satisfying crack in her perfect composure. "I'm going for a walk," Elena said. "Fine," Beatrice replied without looking up. "Just try not to embarrass us further. The founder's luncheon is in 3 days. I expect you to be invisible until then. We have a reputation to maintain, even if you've forgotten how to uphold it." Elena walked out of the room, her heart beating with the cold, rhythmic precision of a ticking clock. As soon as she reached the hallway, she pulled out her phone. The message from Marcus was a link to a financial news breaking bulletin. Vance Anniversary Foundation, unexplained discrepancies in offshore accounts. Elena leaned against the cold stone wall of the corridor, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. Beatrice thought she was selling a cottage to save her son. She didn't realize she was standing on a trapdoor, and Elena had just put her hand on the lever. 3 days, Elena whispered to the empty hallway. She thought of the lakeside cottage, of the pine trees and the quiet water. She wasn't just going to save it. She was going to watch Beatrice Vance realize that the new era she had bragged about was actually the sound of her own legacy collapsing into the dirt. The founder's luncheon wasn't going to be a celebration. It was going to be an execution. 2 days later, the rain-slicked streets of the city felt like a different world from the suffocating, climate-controlled luxury of the Vance estate. Elena Vance shook her umbrella, the cold mist clinging to her coat as she stepped into the cramped, dimly lit office of Marcus Thorne. The air here was heavy with the scent of stale espresso and the metallic, ionized tang of overworked server towers, a sharp, honest contrast to the cloying lilies Beatrice favored. Marcus didn't look up from his array of monitors. His fingers moved with surgical precision across the mechanical keyboard, his face illuminated by a ghostly blue glow that deepened the shadows under his eyes. "It's worse than the initial leak suggested," he said, his voice gravelly from a night of staring at ledgers. He swiveled a screen toward her, the columns of red numbers bleeding into one another. "The foundation isn't just leaking funds, it's a hollowed-out shell. Julian has been treating the offshore accounts like a personal ATM to cover his losses in the Macau high-stakes circuit." She leaned in, her heart hammering a steady, rhythmic pulse against her ribs. She traced a finger over a specific line of data, millions of dollars originally earmarked for pediatric wings and rural literacy programs, now diverted into a shell company titled Vance Holdings LLC. "Does she know?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "She signed every single authorization form," Marcus replied, handing her a sleek digital tablet. Whether she actually read them or was simply blinded by the need to protect her golden boy doesn't change the legal reality. Her signature is right there, time-stamped and verified, sitting directly next to the fraud. Elena felt the weight of the tablet in her hand. It was light, made of glass and aluminum, yet it felt like she was holding a loaded weapon. This was the leverage she had been searching for, the blade she would use to finally sever the Vance legacy from the pedestal Beatrice had built. She tucked the device into her bag, the smooth plastic feeling like cold, unyielding steel against her hip. "Keep digging, Marcus. I need the final forensic audit by tomorrow morning. Don't leave a single stone unturned." The drive back to the estate was a blur of gray sky and skeletal trees. When she walked through the towering front doors, the sound of a sharp, demanding voice echoed from the sunroom. "Not those lilies, Sarah. They look like they belong at a funeral. I want the orchids flown in from Singapore by dawn. The founder's luncheon must be a display of absolute power, not a wake." Elena entered the room, her expression a mask of practiced, submissive indifference. Beatrice stood in the center of a whirlwind of frantic catering staff and decorators, her silk wrap fluttering behind her like the wings of a predatory bird. She spotted her daughter-in-law and her lip curled in an instinctive display of territorial dominance. "There you are," she said, not missing a beat in her critique of the silver settings. "I hope you've spent your time today more productively than usual. I expect that lakeside cottage deed on my desk by tonight. Julian's investors are becoming vocal." "The cottage is still being appraised by the bank," she said calmly, standing her ground. Beatrice stepped closer, the cloying, suffocating scent of her bergamot perfume filling her senses. It was a smell that usually made Elena want to recoil, but today she held her gaze. "Appraised? It's a pile of rotting wood and sentimental garbage. Don't play games with me, girl. You were a charity case when my brother brought you into this family, and you are a liability now. If you don't hand over that property to save Julian's position, I'll make sure the discrepancies in the accounts find a way to be blamed on your late husband's mismanagement. Do you understand? I will burn his memory to the ground to keep my son's name clean." The sheer, naked audacity of the threat made her pulse spike with a sudden, hot flash of rage. Beatrice was willing to tarnish her own dead brother's legacy, a man who had actually cared for the foundation, just to shield her reckless son from his own failures. Elena's nails dug into the leather strap of her bag, her fingers brushing against the tablet. Wait for it, she told herself, the mantra cooling her blood. Just 24 hours more. Let her climb as high as she wants. Julian Vance lounged on the velvet sofa nearby, a glass of expensive amber scotch in his hand despite the early hour. He looked up, a smirk playing on his face as he adjusted his gold Rolex. "Come on, Elena. Just sign the papers. Mom's right. That old shack is falling apart anyway. Think of it as your final contribution to the family. God knows you haven't brought much else to the table besides a pretty face and a lot of silence." He laughed, a hollow, entitled sound that echoed through the high-ceilinged room. He had no idea he was sitting on a mountain of systemic fraud that was about to collapse. He looked at her as if she were a nuisance, a minor obstacle in his path to another year of unearned luxury. "I'll have the final documents ready for the luncheon tomorrow," she said, her voice like polished glass. Beatrice clapped her hands together, a sharp, dismissive sound. "Good. Finally, you're showing a flicker of Vance backbone. Now go change. You look like a common governess in that drab coat. We have guests arriving for the pre-gala dinner in 3 hours, and I won't have you embarrassing us." She retreated to her room, the silence of the upstairs hallway a profound relief after the noise of the sunroom. As she closed the door, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a secure message from Uncle Arthur. "The original bylaws are in my possession. They prove the foundation cannot be dissolved, sold, or leveraged without the unanimous consent of all heirs, including the ones Beatrice tried to strike from the record 5 years ago. She has no legal authority to move that money." She sat on the edge of her bed, looking out at the perfectly manicured gardens that stretched toward the horizon. Tomorrow, Beatrice would stand before the city's elite and announce her new era of Vance leadership. She would brag about her son's vision and her family's enduring grace. And Elena would be there, sitting in the front row, holding the golden ticket that would turn the luncheon into an execution. She touched the tablet in her bag one last time, feeling the hum of the data within. The countdown had reached its final cycle. Tomorrow, the world would see what the Vance name was actually worth. The day before the Vance Foundation luncheon, the manor felt less like a home and more like a gilded cage undergoing a frantic renovation. Elena Vance stood on the mezzanine, her fingers tracing the cold marble railing as she watched the army of decorators below. The air was thick with the cloying, funeral scent of thousands of white lilies and the sharp tang of industrial floor wax. It was a sensory assault, a physical manifestation of the vanity that had sustained this family for decades. Beatrice Vance stood in the center of the foyer, her voice cutting through the hum of activity like a serrated blade. She was draped in silk the color of a bruise, clutching a leather-bound seating chart as if it were a holy relic. When she looked up and spotted her niece, her eyes narrowed into slits of pure, concentrated venom. "Why are you hovering like a vulture, Elena?" Beatrice demanded, her heels clicking a sharp, rhythmic tempo against the stone as she marched toward the stairs. "I told the staff you weren't to be disturbed, which was a polite way of saying stay out of my sight. You're a blemish on the aesthetic I've spent months perfecting." Elena didn't flinch. She didn't even look away. Instead, she descended the stairs with a slow, measured grace that seemed to infuriate the older woman even more. She felt the weight of the tablet in her shoulder bag, a digital guillotine waiting for its moment. "I was just admiring the arrangements," she said, her voice dropping into a calm, melodic register. "It's a lot of effort for something that's going to be dismantled so quickly." Beatrice let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Dantled, this is the beginning of a dynasty. Tomorrow, when I announce the restructuring and Julian takes his rightful place as the face of the foundation, you'll finally understand your place. Or rather, your lack of one. I've moved your seat to the very back near the service entrance. It felt appropriate." "The back?" Elena tilted her head, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. "That's a shame. I'd think you'd want me close enough to see the look on your face when the new era actually begins. You might want to double-check the bylaws one last time, Beatrice. Just to be sure the ground you're standing on is as solid as you think it is." Beatrice's face tightened, the skin around her eyes crinkling with a sudden, flickering uncertainty that she quickly smothered with a sneer. "I don't need advice from a girl who owns nothing but the clothes on her back. My lawyers have scrubbed every inch of the Vance estate. You are a ghost, Elena, and ghosts don't have a vote." From the shadows of the dining room doorway, Sarah Vance watched the exchange, her hand trembling as she held a crystal water pitcher. She saw the way Elena stood, not like a victim, but like a predator waiting for the sun to hit the right angle. The confidence radiating from the younger woman was terrifying. It was the look of someone who already knew the ending of the story. "Just a friendly warning," Elena whispered, leaning in just close enough for Beatrice to smell the faint, citrus scent of her perfume. "Pride is a heavy thing to carry. You wouldn't want to trip on it in front of the entire city." She turned and walked away before Beatrice could find a retort, her footsteps silent on the expensive rugs. As she crossed the hall, she ran into Julian Vance. He looked disheveled, the smell of expensive scotch trailing him even at midday. He was leaning against a mahogany sideboard, tossing a heavy gold coin into the air and catching it with a smug grin. "Big day tomorrow, cuz," Julian said, his voice thick with unearned triumph. "Mom says we're finally cutting the dead weight. I've already got the brokers lined up to leverage the foundation's holdings. By this time tomorrow, I'll be the most powerful man in the zip code, and you'll be looking for a studio apartment in the slums." Elena stopped and looked at him, truly looked at him, with a pity that was far more insulting than anger. "You really have no idea what you've done, do you, Julian? You've spent your whole life playing with fire, assuming the house was fireproof because your name was on the door. The house is mine," he snapped, the coin slipping through his fingers and clattering onto the floor. "Everything is mine. Enjoy the dream while you're still asleep," she replied softly. By sunset, the manor fell into a deceptive, heavy silence. Elena sat in her room, the only light coming from the glow of her phone. She looked at the final confirmation from Marcus Thorne. The forensic trail was complete. The evidence of Julian's embezzlement and Beatrice's complicity was synchronized and ready for broadcast. She touched the screen, her heart beating with a steady, cold rhythm. The countdown had ended. Tomorrow wasn't just a luncheon. It was a funeral for the Vance name, and she was the only one who had brought the shovel. She closed her eyes, listening to the wind rattle the window panes, waiting for the morning that would change everything. By 2 o'clock the following afternoon, the Vance solarium was a masterpiece of curated deception. The air was thick with the cloying scent of white lilies and the sharp, metallic tang of expensive champagne chilling in silver buckets. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling glass, glinting off the polished marble and the heavy gold jewelry of the city's elite. Beatrice Vance stood at the center of the room, her laughter ringing out like a practiced bell as she held court among the board members and socialites she had spent decades cultivating. She was draped in emerald silk that cost more than a mid-sized sedan, her fingers fluttering as she gestured toward the sprawling gardens. To the casual observer, she was the undisputed matriarch of a dynasty at its zenith. To Elena, who stood silently near the shadows of the arched entryway, she looked like a building with a hollow foundation, one gust of wind away from total collapse. Elena felt the weight of her phone in her silk clutch, a cold, rectangular promise of justice. Marcus Thorne had sent the final encrypted file an hour ago. The forensic trail was no longer a theory. It was a map of every dollar Julian had siphoned and every document Beatrice had forged to cover his tracks. "Elena, darling, don't just stand there like a piece of the architecture," Beatrice called out, her voice cutting through the hum of conversation. The room went quiet as 20 pairs of eyes shifted toward the doorway. Beatrice's smile didn't reach her eyes, which remained as cold and hard as flint. "I realized I forgot to tell you. The catering staff needs someone to oversee the dessert plating. Since you aren't exactly occupied with hosting duties, I'm sure you won't mind helping out in the kitchen." A ripple of suppressed titters went through the group of women surrounding Beatrice. It was a calculated strike, a public reminder of Elena's perceived status as the family's charity case. "I think I'll stay right here, Beatrice," Elena replied, her voice remarkably steady. She stepped fully into the light, the simple, charcoal-gray lines of her dress providing a sharp contrast to the gaudy opulence of the room. "I wouldn't want to miss the toast. It feels like a historical moment, doesn't it?" Beatrice's eyes narrowed, her grip tightening on her crystal flute. "History is written by those who belong at the table, Elena, not those who are lucky to have a seat at all." Julian stepped up beside his mother, adjusting his silk tie with a smirk that oozed unearned confidence. He looked every bit the favored son, though Elena could see the slight tremor in his hand, the telltale sign of a man who had been gambling with money that wasn't his. "Let her stay, mother," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Every performance needs an audience, even the ones who can't afford a ticket." Elena didn't flinch. She simply nodded toward the far end of the room where Sarah Vance sat with Uncle Arthur. Sarah looked pale, her eyes darting nervously between her mother and Elena, but Arthur was a different story. The estranged patriarch sat like a stone monument, his cane resting between his knees. When he caught Elena's eye, he gave a single, imperceptible nod. He knew. He had seen the original legal secrets, and he was here to witness the reckoning. The sensory details of the room began to sharpen for Elena. The condensation dripping down the side of a nearby ice bucket, the rhythmic asterisk clack-clack-clack of Beatrice's designer heels as she paced the marble, and the distant, low hum of the estate's security gates opening to admit the final guests. Among them were the very people Julian had defrauded, including Mayor Higgins and the head of the Vance Foundation's audit committee. They were all here, sipping vintage wine and laughing at Julian's jokes, completely unaware that they were standing in the middle of a crime scene. "Is everything ready?" a voice whispered near Elena's ear. She didn't turn to see Marcus, who had slipped into the room disguised as part of the technical team managing the solarium's integrated media system. "The link is live," she murmured. "The moment she starts the presentation for the new development project, the servers will override." "You're sure about this?" Marcus asked. "There's no going back once the first slide hits the screen." "I've spent my whole life going back for them," Elena said, her gaze fixed on Beatrice. "It's time they moved forward into the truth." Beatrice clapped her hands, the sharp sound echoing off the glass walls. "Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, we are gathered here not just for our annual Thanksgiving luncheon, but to celebrate the dawn of the Vance Legacy Project." The guests began to migrate toward the center of the solarium, forming a semicircle around a large, high-definition display screen that had been set up near the podium. Julian stood off to the side, looking triumphant, his chest puffed out as he prepared to take credit for the fraudulent expansion plans. Elena watched as Beatrice took her place behind the podium. The older woman looked radiant, the sunlight catching the diamonds at her throat. She looked like the picture of success, a woman who believed she had successfully buried her sins under layers of silk and social standing. For generations, the Vance name has stood for integrity and prosperity, Beatrice began, her voice projecting with practiced authority. Today, my son Julian and I are proud to reveal the financial roadmap that will secure our family's influence for the next 50 years. This isn't just about wealth, it's about the permanence of our name. Elena felt a surge of cold adrenaline. She reached into her clutch and felt the screen of her phone. She swiped the notification that Marcus had sent. System override. Ready. She looked at Sarah, who was now gripping the arms of her chair so hard her knuckles were white. She looked at Julian, who was busy winking at a young associate from the bank. Finally, she looked at Beatrice, who was reaching for the remote to start the digital presentation. "You always said I didn't understand the value of the Vance name, Beatrice," Elena said softly, though her voice didn't carry past her own personal space. "But I think I'm the only one who actually knows what it's worth." Beatrice raised the remote, her thumb hovering over the play button. She looked out over the crowd of the city's most powerful people, her face glowing with the anticipation of her greatest performance yet. "And now," Beatrice announced, her smile widening to its most predatory curve, "let us look at the future we've built." She pressed the button. The screen flickered, but instead of the glossy architectural renderings of the new development, a single, high-resolution image of a wire transfer receipt appeared. The room went deathly silent. The numbers on the screen were staggering, and the name on the recipient line was not Vance Legacy Project. It was a private offshore account in Julian's name. Beatrice's smile froze. The remote slipped from her fingers, clattering against the marble floor with a sound like a gunshot. She turned toward the screen, her eyes widening as the first document was replaced by a second. A scanned copy of her own signature on a forged power of attorney. Elena stepped forward out of the shadows, her eyes locked on Beatrice's crumbling composure. "The future is here, Beatrice. Are you ready to explain it?" The silence in the ballroom was no longer respectful. It was a physical weight, heavy and suffocating. The projector's cooling fan hummed with a low, mechanical whine that seemed to grow louder as the guests stared at the screen. The blue light washed over Beatrice Vance, stripping away the carefully curated elegance she had worn like armor for decades. The mask didn't just slip, it shattered. Her skin, usually a flawless porcelain canvas maintained by the most expensive serums, turned a sickly, translucent gray. The twitch in her left cheek became a rhythmic spasm, pulling the corner of her mouth upward into a grotesque, involuntary half-smile that contrasted sharply with the sheer terror in her eyes. Her breath came in shallow, jagged hitches, the sound audible through the microphone she still held in a white-knuckled grip. Her eyes darted from the screen to the faces in the crowd, searching for a single ally, but she found only a sea of recoiling judgment. She looked less like a socialite and more like a cornered animal, her pupils dilating until her eyes were nothing but black voids of panic. "This is a mistake," she whispered, the microphone amplifying her trembling voice until it boomed through the speakers. "A digital glitch. Some low-level staffer must have uploaded the wrong files." "The wrong files, Beatrice?" Uncle Arthur stepped forward from the front row. He didn't look angry. He looked weary, his gaze fixed on the forged signature that bore his own name. He moved back a step, physically distancing himself from her as if her disgrace were contagious. "That is my name on a power of attorney I never signed, and that is Julian's account number." Near the bar, Julian Vance dropped his crystal tumbler. The sound of shattering glass echoed like a gunshot, the smell of spilled, high-end bourbon rising sharply from the plush carpet. He stared at the screen, his face flushing a deep, guilty crimson. He tried to speak, but only a strangled, pathetic sound escaped his throat. Sarah Vance gasped, her hand flying to the throat of her designer gown, her fingers twisting the pearls there until the string looked ready to snap. She looked at her mother with a mixture of horror and dawning realization, her chair scraping harshly against the marble floor as she retreated. "Julian, say something," Beatrice snapped, her voice cracking. "Tell them Elena is lying. Tell them she's been planning this since we took her in." Elena didn't flinch. She stood near the podium, the cold marble smooth beneath her fingertips. She felt a strange, detached calm. The rage that had fueled her for years had cooled into something far more dangerous: clarity. She watched the board members, men and women who had laughed at Beatrice's cruel jokes at Elena's expense, now shuffling their feet, avoiding eye contact with the woman who had just been exposed as a common thief. "I didn't have to plan anything, Beatrice," Elena said, her voice a calm, crystalline vibrato that carried to the back of the room. "I just had to stop covering for you. I spent 10 years protecting the Vance legacy because I thought I owed you my gratitude. But Marcus Thorne helped me realize that the only thing I owed you was the truth." Marcus stepped into the light, his tablet glowing as he scrolled through a live feed of the offshore transactions. "The funds were moved 48 hours ago," he told the room, his tone clinical and professional. "Every cent is accounted for, and every cent has been frozen by the authorities." "You little bitch!" Beatrice lunged forward, her manicured nails clawing at the air toward Elena. The room erupted. 2 security guards, who had been standing discreetly by the doors, moved with practiced efficiency. They didn't grab her roughly, but their presence was an absolute barrier. They stepped between the 2 women, their faces expressionless. Beatrice stopped, her chest heaving, her hair beginning to fray from its perfect chignon. She looked at the crowd, the elite of the city, the people she had looked down upon while spending their investment capital on Julian's gambling debts. They were all looking at her now, but not with the envy she craved. They looked at her with the same disgust she had once reserved for Elena's modest shoes. "You said I was a stain on the Vance name," Elena said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that somehow felt louder than Beatrice's screaming. "But it turns out you were just the ink. And today, the page is being turned." Elena didn't wait for a rebuttal. She didn't stay to watch the police, who were already appearing at the ballroom entrance. She didn't need to see the handcuffs or the way Julian would surely try to trade his mother's freedom for his own. She turned her back on the wreckage of the family that had tried to break her. As she walked toward the grand oak doors, the rhythmic click of her heels was the only sound in the sudden, stunned silence of the room. She didn't look back. She had a different meeting to attend, and for the first time in her life, she was the one holding the keys. 20 minutes had passed since the doors of the Vance ballroom had swung shut behind her, but the adrenaline still hummed through Elena's veins like a live wire. She sat in the back of a charcoal sedan, the scent of expensive leather and rain-damp wool filling the small space. Beside her, Marcus Thorne tapped rhythmically on his tablet, the blue light reflecting off his sharp features. They were moving toward the Vance estate, the ancestral home that Beatrice had guarded like a fortress for 30 years. "The police have Julian in custody at the hotel," Marcus said, his voice a calm anchor in the storm. "They're bringing Beatrice back to the house now. She insisted on supervising the retrieval of her personal effects. She still thinks she can talk her way out of a forensic audit." Elena looked out the window as the heavy iron gates of the estate appeared through the drizzle. "She doesn't know about the second trust, does she?" "No," a voice came from the front passenger seat. Uncle Arthur turned slightly, his eyes holding a weary sort of triumph. "She spent decades trying to bury my branch of the family tree, convinced that my father's debts had severed our claim. She never realized he didn't just leave me debt. He left me the original land deeds that predated the Vance Corporation's charter." The car pulled to a stop in the circular driveway. The grand limestone facade of the mansion looked cold under the gray sky. Within minutes, a black SUV pulled up behind them, and Beatrice was ushered out by 2 officers. She wasn't in handcuffs yet, a courtesy extended due to her age and status, but her posture was rigid with a fury that seemed to vibrate off the pavement. They gathered in the grand study, a room filled with the smell of old paper and beeswax. Beatrice stood in the center of the Persian rug, her silk gown stained with a splash of red wine from the gala, looking like a fallen queen. Julian was absent, but Sarah Vance sat in the corner, her face pale, her eyes fixed on Elena with a mixture of fear and profound realization. "This is an outrage," Beatrice snapped, her voice trembling but still trying to command the room. She turned her gaze on Elena, her lip curling in a familiar sneer. "You think a few doctored spreadsheets and some ancient gossip from a senile old man will hold up? I built this name. I protected this family while your mother was busy being a common failure. You are a parasite, Elena. A common thief trying to scavenge what you could never earn." Elena didn't flinch. She felt the weight of the silver key in her pocket, the one Marcus had handed her an hour ago. "I didn't steal anything, Beatrice. I simply looked at the ledger. You've been liquidating the family's charitable foundations to cover Julian's gambling debts for 3 years. That's not protecting a legacy. That's a fire sale." Marcus stepped forward, laying a thick manila folder on the mahogany desk. "It's more than that. We have the offshore transfer records. You didn't just cover the debts. You forged Elena's signature on the liability waivers to make her the legal fall girl if the SEC ever came knocking." Beatrice's face didn't just lose color. It seemed to undergo a total structural collapse. The mask of the indomitable socialite disintegrated, leaving behind a hollow, terrified stranger. Her skin took on the gray, waxy hue of a guttering candle, and the fine lines she'd spent thousands to hide emerged as deep, jagged trenches of panic. Her eyes, once cold and calculating, now darted with the frantic, wet desperation of a trapped animal, refusing to settle on the legal documents that lay like a death warrant on the desk. Her mouth worked soundlessly, her lips trembling so violently that her dark red lipstick smeared against her teeth, making her look less like a queen and more like a wounded, frantic predator whose forest was on fire. The silence in the room was absolute. Marcus watched her with the clinical detachment of a surgeon. Uncle Arthur didn't even look at her. He was busy examining a portrait on the wall as if she had already ceased to exist. Sarah, however, stood up slowly. She walked toward the desk, picked up one of the wire transfer receipts, and read the name at the bottom. "You told me Elena was the one draining the accounts," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking. "You made me hate her so I wouldn't look at you." "Sarah, darling, I did it for us," Beatrice started, her voice a shrill, desperate rasp. "Don't," Sarah said, dropping the paper as if it were coated in poison. She stepped back, physically distancing herself from her mother, moving toward the window where Elena stood. The flip was instantaneous and devastating. The witnesses, the officers, the lawyers, and her own daughter all looked at Beatrice with a unified expression of visceral disgust. Elena stepped toward the center of the room. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "The forensic team is already at the office. The locks have been changed at the firm, and your personal accounts have been frozen pending the criminal investigation. You have 1 hour to gather your clothes. Anything else, the jewelry, the art, the furniture, stays. It was all purchased with embezzled funds." Beatrice lunged forward, her hands clawing at the air. "You can't kick me out. This is my house. I am a Vance." "Actually," Elena said, her voice as cold as the rain hitting the window pane, "according to the dissolution of the primary trust, this house belongs to the majority shareholder of the new holding company. And since your shares were forfeited the moment the fraud was verified." She paused, letting the reality sink in. "I own this house, Beatrice. You're just a guest who has overstayed her welcome." Beatrice sank into a chair, her shoulders slumped, the silk of her dress rustling in the quiet room. She looked small. For the first time in her life, she looked her age. Elena didn't stay to watch the officers lead her upstairs to pack. She didn't need the satisfaction of a final argument. She turned to Marcus and Uncle Arthur, nodding once. As she walked out of the study, the rhythmic click of her heels on the marble floor sounded like a countdown finally reaching 0. She stepped out onto the porch, breathing in the cold, clean air of the afternoon. Behind her, the heavy front doors groaned shut, the sound echoing through the valley. She walked toward the car without looking back, leaving the wreckage of the Vance dynasty to be hauled away in the back of a police cruiser. For the first time in years, the weight was gone. She wasn't the victim anymore. She was the architect of her own future. 6 months had passed since the heavy oak doors of the Vance estate had clicked shut, sealing away a century of secrets and a weekend of absolute wreckage. Elena Vance stood on the balcony of her new office, a glass-walled sanctuary overlooking the city's financial district. The air up here was thin and cold, smelling faintly of the rain that had washed the smog away an hour earlier. She adjusted the cuff of her silk blouse, feeling the weight of the silver watch her uncle had given her for her 30th birthday. It wasn't a family heirloom. It was a gift bought with clean money, and it kept time with a precision the old dynasty never possessed. A soft chime echoed through the room as the door opened. Marcus Thorne stepped in, his usual charcoal suit replaced by a lighter navy, though his expression remained as disciplined as ever. He carried a single manila folder, the final thread of a tapestry they had been unweaving for half a year. "The audit is complete," he said, his voice low and steady. "The last of the offshore accounts have been frozen. The creditors took the downtown penthouse and the vineyard, but the main estate remains yours, unencumbered. Every cent Julian Vance diverted has been accounted for and redirected to the trust." Elena turned from the window, her gaze landing on the folder. She didn't reach for it. She didn't need to. "And the legal proceedings." "Julian accepted the plea deal this morning," he replied, moving to the mahogany desk. 2 years in a minimum security facility for financial fraud. He'll be out in 18 months if he behaves, but he'll never be allowed to sit on a corporate board again. He's effectively a ghost in the world he used to run. She nodded slowly. The rage that had once burned like a fever had cooled into a hard, diamond-like clarity. She thought of her brother, once so vibrant and reckless, now reduced to a case number. It was a victory, but it tasted of iron and old dust. "And her?" she asked. The accountant paused, his hand hovering over the desk. "Beatrice Vance is living in a 1-bedroom apartment in the Heights. It's a 4th-floor walk-up. The building smells of cabbage and damp wood. She tried to use a canceled club membership card at the plaza last Tuesday. Security escorted her out in front of the lunch crowd." Elena felt a sharp, involuntary pang in her chest, not of pity, but of recognition. She knew that look. She had lived that humiliation for years, while her mother-in-law had looked down from a pedestal of stolen gold. Now, the roles weren't just reversed. They were solidified by the cold hand of the law. Later that afternoon, she found herself driving through the lower end of the city, far from the manicured lawns and gated driveways of her youth. She pulled her car to the curb across from a dingy, neon-lit laundromat. The sound of the city was a chaotic symphony of honking horns and distant sirens. Through the streaked glass of the storefront, she saw a woman sitting on a plastic chair, staring at a rotating dryer. It was her. The woman who had once refused to touch a doorknob without silk gloves was now wearing a pilled gray cardigan that looked 2 sizes too small. Her hair, once a masterpiece of silver blonde perfection, was pulled back into a thin, messy knot. She looked small. She looked like a ghost haunting her own life. Elena watched as a younger woman accidentally bumped into the older woman's cart. In the old world, she would have unleashed a torrent of status-based vitriol, demanding an apology for the perceived stain on her dignity. Now, she simply flinched, pulling her feet back and clutching a plastic jug of cheap detergent to her chest. She didn't even look up. The fire was gone, replaced by the hollow, gray exhaustion of someone who had realized that her name no longer carried the power to command the air in a room. The protagonist put the car in gear and drove away. She didn't stop to gloat. She didn't need to hear the woman's voice or see the recognition in her eyes. The silence was the greatest punishment she could have delivered. She drove back to the estate, the long driveway now flanked by overgrown hedges she hadn't yet bothered to trim. The house loomed ahead, grand and silent. Uncle Arthur was waiting on the porch, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper, but there was a peace in his posture that hadn't been there when he was the family's hidden shame. "Sarah Vance called," he said as she climbed the stairs. "She's finished her first semester. She says she's not coming back for the summer. She's taking an internship in London. She wants to start over, Elena. Somewhere the name doesn't mean anything." Elena leaned against the stone railing, looking out over the valley. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the lawn. She had the house. She had the fortune. She had the justice she had craved since the day she realized her life was a curated lie. But the rooms inside were empty. The dinner table, once a battlefield of barbs and betrayals, was now just a piece of expensive furniture. She had won the war, but she was the only soldier left on the field. "Let her go," she whispered, the cold wind catching her words. "Let her be the first of us to live a life that isn't a debt." She reached into her pocket and felt the heavy brass key to the study. It was a cold, solid weight. She had spent her life trying to belong in this house, only to realize that true power was the ability to leave it behind. She turned toward the door, the rhythmic click of her heels on the stone sounding like a final, decisive period at the end of a very long sentence. The architect had finished her work. Now she had to learn how to live in the ruins.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.